Hi, I'm Brian Grise with Edge Technologies. This is part 4 of my series on bar feed remnant length. Uh, in this video, I'm going to focus specifically on fixed headstock applications and sub-spindle pulling processes. Previously, we focused more on sliding headstock or Swiss headstock applications. This time, we're going to look at fixed headstock applications. Previously, when we looked at sliding headstock applications and we looked at the remnant length, the remnants were fairly long in those applications due to the remnant being generated by the distance from the cutoff tool through the sliding guide bushing, through the main spindle collet, and into a bar feed extraction collet. That made a fairly long remnant, which would be typical for a Swiss or sliding headstock application. Remnants of 9 to 12 inches, sometimes longer, depending on part length, is not uncommon. In a fixed headstock application, the remnant lengths are generally significantly shorter. We have enough material to have in the work holding of the lathe and then into a bar feed extraction collet in an extraction application. This remnant length is affected by where we part off in reference to the face of the main spindle collet. The closer that you part off to the main spindle collet in your application or in your process is going to give you the shortest possible remnant. You see, as we increase the distance that we part off from the main spindle collet, that increases the length of our remnant significantly. So ideally, you want to part off as close to the face of the main spindle collet as possible. You notice here when we change to an ejection application, this would be a typical short loader application where we're not extracting the remnant, but we're ejecting out the front. We actually gain some machinable material here because we don't have the extra material that's contained within the bar feed extraction collet. We can get this remnant down to a very short remnant, with again the caveat being cutting off as close to the face of the main spindle collet as possible. Any material sticking out of the main spindle collet when we part off is additional remnant, same as it was in the previous case. Now let's look at the different feeding methods and how that affects the remnant length. So if we're feeding to a stop, we have a feeding to stop application in an ejection application, so we don't have the extraction collet. This would be a typical short loader application. Let's say we have 10 inches worth of material here. So we have 10 inches worth of material and we're feeding to a stop. This would be the part off of the previous part, and we have 10 inches of material remaining. Now, the bar feeder wouldn't display 10 inches of usable material. It would probably display roughly 8.5 or 9 inches of usable material because the usable material ends at the back of the work holding. The material through the work holding and sticking out of the main collet is not included in the usable material according to the bar feeder's measurement. So if we take this material and we feed it out, let's say we have a 4.5 inch stick out or 4.5 inch feed out length, right? That's our part length. That leaves us 5.5 inches of material behind the face of the main spindle collet. Again, an inch or inch and a half of this at this point is still unmachinable because it has to be able to be held in the work holding. At that point, we're going to make our 4.5 inch part. We're going to machine that part into that material that's sticking out. We come in and we pick off with our sub spindle and part off at the face of the main collet. Once we part off, we pull that completed part away and that gives us the opportunity to feed out the next part. You notice we feed out our 4.5 inches again, and that leaves us about an inch in the work holding. We can machine that part, pick it off, and part it off, and we have about a 1 inch remnant here left, which is a very, very good remnant length. That's about as short as we're going to get. That would be an ideal application, feeding to a stop. You notice the remnant is minimized, the machined material is maximized to where we have the least amount of remnant and the most amount of material machined into our parts, which are more valuable. Alternatively, we could have a sub-spindle pulling application, and here's where things get uh, changed a little bit, and sometimes people can be a little bit confused by why their remnant becomes so long, and so I'm going to explain that. So we have the same 4.5 inch part, except at this point we're sub-spindle pulling, so we pick the part and we pull it out first so that the material for the next part is already sticking out of the main spindle collet before we part off. Okay, we part off, and now we have our 4.5 inches of material sticking out of the main spindle collet, and we have our another 4.5 inches of material behind it. Okay, we machine that part 4.5 inches. We come in to pick it off. We pick it off with the sub spindle. We pull it out to part off, and you can see we've pulled that material right out of the main spindle collet because we pulled it 4.5 inches and there was only 4.5 inches of material left. So when we part this off, we're not holding on to anything on the main spindle side. So in this application, once we've achieved 9 inches of material left, that's our remnant, because the bar feeder recognizes we can't perform another 4.5 inch feed out without the material exiting the main spindle collet. So it's gonna turn on the end of bar output in this position right here after this part off. Okay, and you could machine this part, and if you get really creative with your programming and you change your part off to be right here at the face of the collet, you could complete this part. But that's some pretty creative programming in the lathe. You'd have to be a pretty good applications engineer to be able to do that. And then you'd shorten that remnant to 4.5 inches. But typically, you're going to wind up with a 9 inch remnant here because the bar feeder is outputting end of bar because it knows you can machine this part, but you can't pull it out. And that's the condition we have with a sub-spindle pulling application. Maybe you say, but Brian, on the feed to stop application, you had a 10 inch bar. This is only a 9 inch bar. Where'd that extra inch go? And you think you caught me. So let's look at that. Okay, here we have that 10 inch bar. We have your 4.5 inch stick out to manufacture your part, and we've got 5.5 inches behind it. That's the same 10 inch bar that we had on the previous example with the feed to stop application. So here we machine your 4.5 inch part with the 5.5 inches of material remaining behind it. We come in with the sub spindle, we pick and we pull your 4.5 inches out for the next part, and we part off. Here we've parted off. We have that part separate. We've got 5.5 inches of material left, about an inch in the collet, 4.5 inches sticking out. So we've just gained, by adding 1 inch to that bar length, we've gained the ability to uh, complete this part, pull it out, and pick it off. Now we're in a condition where we could machine that next part. However, we get into the same scenario as we did previously, where once we pick and pull this part, we pull the material right out of the main spindle collet. So here we come in, we pick off, we pull that out, and now we have nothing in the main spindle collet to hold on to. In this case, you could probably cycle this, part this off, and just drop this as a remnant into your remnant bin. And that would actually be an ideal scenario. You just have to be really careful because obviously the specific length of the bar is crucial that it remains consistent for this to work successfully. Otherwise, you end up with a very long remnant here that you're parting off and dropping into your remnant bin. Another situation that may occur that you have to pay attention to as the applications engineer or programmer on the lathe is this main chuck or main collet is going to close. Does it have sensing to recognize that it's gripping and there's no material present? If it does, that may alarm the lathe out. There may be a way to bypass that or overcome that. You'd have to check with your lathe OEM to figure out how to bypass that or ignore that in this scenario. Again, we're getting into a little bit creative programming because the bar feeder would have outputted at end of bar condition prior to beginning to machine this part. So you would have to ignore the end of bar signal and rather than jumping to a bar change, tell the lathe to go ahead and machine this part anyway and part it off. And after this is complete, then jump to bar change. In that case, you're getting into a little bit of creative programming, but it can be done if you're a competent programmer. So with those details being explained, hopefully it should be clear at this point why in a sub-spindle pulling application, your remnant length is going to be significantly longer than it is with a feed to turret stop application, barring any fancy programming within the lathe to overcome that, which can be done if you have the capabilities to do that. But typically, your remnant is significantly longer because, as I explained, as you're sticking out 4.5 inches, this is an end of bar condition for the bar feeder because it can't feed that 4.5 inches again, and it knows that. So unless your process specifically requires sub-spindle pulling due to the actual part or the process of the part itself, my recommendation is always try to avoid that. You don't gain anything. You don't gain any time. In fact, it probably takes longer, and you lose machinable material and wind up with more remnant that in a feed to turret stop application could be machined and turned into a part. Hopefully, this helps to clear up some confusion regarding fixed headstock applications and remnant length related to sub-spindle pulling applications.